All right, everyone. So we're back for one more lecture on Unit 2. This is going to wrap things up pretty much for this unit as far as topic points go. And then there is a 2.7, but that's about comparison, something that we'll talk about with our review and something that we will be doing with our essay, which will be the DBQ essay this year. Okay. So the topics 2.5 and 2.6 are all about the consequences of connectivity. So we're talking about cultural and environmental consequences today. And some of the things we're going to talk about in today's lecture are very similar to some things we've already talked about in previous units, especially when we talked about certain empires, as far as, Southeast Asia and other places. This will look familiar. So we're all trying to kind of, fortify this understanding of how trade has this enormous amount of influence on the areas that it touches and the people that it's connected to. There he goes. So the essential questions today is identify and explain two cultural and environmental impacts of trade during the period of 1200 1450, something that I will have you respond to in Canvas as always. So context of this is like new technologies. And we've talked about new technologies that help fortify and expand trade. The camel saddle, the lateen sail, the rudder, the magnetic compass, the astrolabe, all of these are new technologies that are making trade much simpler and easier and more manageable for those who are taking part in it. There's new powerful trading cities that we've talked about in the past. Along the Silk Road, you have Samarkand, and you have Timbuktu in West Africa. You have Calicut, and in the Southeast Ocean, the Swahili city-states. All of these are examples of such. And so, new cities help promote trade. They become centerpieces of markets. They become areas where people are going to be able to converge to trade the various goods that they bring from different places within this region and these regions. So those are all important things to note. And because of the expansion of trade, because of the movement of more people, you have more exchange of goods and ideas. And I made a little error there. It should be ideas, okay? So increased cross-cultural interactions resulted in the diffusion of literary, artistic, and cultural traditions, as well as scientific and technological innovations. So we've talked about this in previous units, the influence of Buddhism. Buddhism is one of the major religions of the East Asia, the cultural hearth of Buddhism comes from northern India. And even though India does not full-scale adopt Buddhism for the long run, the missionaries and the merchants that travel along the Silk Road will spread it into East Asia and along the Silk Roads in general. And because China is a kind of a powerful civilization, you have these satellite civilizations of Korea and Japan that are going to be influenced by the Chinese civilization. They too will adopt Buddhism, and Buddhism will be adopted into these areas as it adapts to those areas, and as the area adapts to Buddhism sometimes too. We talk about how Buddhism wasn't very welcome to begin with when it first introduced into China during the Han Dynasty, and over time it found a way to adapt to kind of the culture of China, especially when it came to like those Confucius principles about filial piety. Where how do you find Buddhism? Is it just one way through meditation and self-reflection? No, it can be found through service, and so you can take care of your elders. As was expected in Confucius principles, and still kind of through that service help get you closer to enlightenment. And so, local religions and belief systems also adapted to the introduction of Buddhism too. We talked about that with Neo-Confucianism, where many of the Confucius principles had already stuck around, past. The Han Dynasty and into the Song and Tang dynasties, but they adapted and included more elements of that spiritual understanding that comes with Buddhism and Taoism. And so Neo-Confucianism comes through that kind of interaction between those different belief systems. Spread of Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia. I didn't continue that title for some reason, but the trade that connects these regions also spreads Buddhism and Hinduism in Southeast Asia. We talked about some empires that grow during this time period, and a lot of them connected to those trade networks. And in doing so, they are connected to these ideas as they spread. So the Majapahit, the Sinhala, and the Sukhothai empires were all good examples of empires that became essentially Buddhist in principle and in governance. And so those are some really important examples, and you can see where the spread of Buddhism and Hinduism just kind of spread. Hinduism spreads into other parts outside of South Asia, in particular the Srivijayan Empire, which was here at this choke point of the Strait of Malacca, a very powerful trading empire, as they were kind of the go-between between India and China, and created these large, train of thought. These large empires, this large empire that had huge markets where everyone just kind of traveled to, because it was a very convenient place between the two. The Khmer Empire showed elements of both. I mean, you guys recall in our previous lectures when we talked about the Angkor Wat. The Angkor Wat was developed in the Khmer Empire, and originally was a Hindu empire. So a lot of the structures, especially kind of how it has this kind of steps on the top of their dome there, that's supposed to reflect the different castes of Hinduism. But over time, the Khmer Empire, many of them converted to Buddhism, and rather than erase that entire structure, they added onto it and added elements of Buddhism. So remember, College Board is always looking for examples of where you see syncretic culture and cultural blending, and that's a great artifact of on the cultural landscape that reflects both Hindu and Buddhist architectural styles. So yeah. Technological innovations also spread as a result of trade. Of course, gunpowder from China, in which gunpowder was discovered by alchemists seeking the elixir for immortality. I love the irony in that. What they discovered was something that would forever change warfare and around the world. And so, the first weaponized use of gunpowder was with these things called fire cannons, in which they would basically blow a big, fire, like a little mini flamethrower that doesn't sustain, and then it would make a loud noise, and it could confuse and hurt your enemy to an extent, but it wasn't as deadly as like guns are today, because they didn't shoot out projectiles like they do today. The fire cannons themselves were improved upon by the Arabs, as they found a better balance of gunpowder to weight ratio of the projectile that you can put into it. And eventually the gun spreads through the Italians that kind of began using it in 1350. The Italians, of course, through the powerful Italian city-states of Venice, Florence, Genoa, they are going to be the go-between between the Arab world and Europe, as they were originally the cities in which the Crusaders left to go crusade into the Middle East and to the Holy Lands, as they were. And through the exposure, they bring back a lot of things, including the idea of the gun. So these are something that will happen in the later Crusades, as they become these Italian city-states dominate the Mediterranean trade up until the arrival of the Ottomans, which will muscle them out and fight for control over that. Paper from China also, that's important. We talked about how, gunpowder is a really important invention. It changes warfare as we know it, right? But the pen is always mightier than the sword, as they say. And so, imagine a world without like books and writing and paper. And so that is going to start from China, the way we make paper, and then it's going to spread. Chinese kept this secret for a long time, until the battle for Talas River. And so the Chinese scholars that were captured by the Muslim armies would then teach them how to make paper. And this helps spread an enormous increase of education, the spread of ideas. We've, of course, talked about in the past about Dar al-Islam and having these Islamic centers for learning, such as the House of Wisdom, and these libraries that are connected to these. And so this is not possible without the invention of paper. And that's something that was started in China and spread to different parts of Dar al-Islam through trade. And of course, by 1150, we'll start to see paper being introduced. There's different forms of paper, but the papers that we typically associate with paper today being introduced into Europe by 1150 itself. Not to mention the paper did exist beforehand. There was the papyrus paper that Egypt did, but the paper as we know it is, and what we typically use today comes from China. So cultural consequences also include the fate of cities, how it changes and varies differently from period to period. And so during this period, because of trade, you'll see significant rise of cities, and then also a significant decline of cities because of other factors as well. Something that we're not going to talk too much detail about, but the rise of new cities: Hangzhou, Samarkand, Kashgar, Timbuktu, Novgorod, Calicut, and Venice, Florence, and Genoa. All of these cities, rise because they become major trading centers, either being at the crossroads like Samarkand of the northern and southern routes of Silk Road. Hangzhou is a major manufacturing center for porcelain and iron, as it were, and something that China dominated in the manufacturing of during this time period. Calicut, which would be a major manufacturing and trading point of cotton textiles. Novgorod, which is in Russia, connected to the Volga River, which then connected to the Baltic Sea. And so the trade in the northern Baltic Sea along the northern coast of Europe was really important at that time. And as these cities grow and they become more urban, they're also becoming very, very diverse. We've talked about this with like the Swahili states, which I probably should mention in here too, that they are coming about and they're leading to a much more cosmopolitan society where you have people living amongst each other of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. And because of that, you see more cross-cultural trade itself. This still happens today. Go to New York City, and New York City offers a large variety of cultural exchanges and in particular food, because if you see Mr. Henry likes food. And, New York has some of the best in the world because there are so many different varieties of it. And that's finding its way everywhere, even in our small little city of Salt Lake. So there's also a decline that's going on in other cities. Baghdad, we talked about being wrecked by the Mongol invasion. Rome had been kind of in a decline, but it still held a large regard because of the Vatican City and the basically the headquarters for the Catholic Church that still remained there. Constantinople is another one, and this is something we're going to talk more about when we get to the Gunpowder empires. But Constantinople is going to collapse in 1453. It's a big moment in history, and it's kind of why we talk about 1450 as being the end of this time period that we've been getting into. But that had been in decline because of the Seljuk Turks continuously taking away land from the Byzantine Empire, and that is going to weaken Constantinople to the point where even its mighty walls and all the power it once had can't protect it from what comes and eventually leads to Constantinople becoming Istanbul. So there's a lot of cultural exchanges, because the networks are intensifying and such. It also leads to an increased number of travelers. And this is a time period where most people do not travel within outside 25 miles of their own birthplace. You're born in one place, you tend to stay in one place, and it's not as much traveling as you would see into the world today. And that's because the world today is much more interconnected, and we have technology that allows us to travel to places further and faster than we have in any point in history. But during this time, there are some travelers that are really important, worth noting, because not only do they do something that was rare of that time and period, they also record their journeys and they give us some insight of what the world was like during this time period as they observe and look through the world through their own lenses and their eyes of what they see and experience far away. And we're going to dive a little bit more of the assignment that I've given on Canvas that's associated with a couple of these travelers, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. And I'm sure most of you have heard the term or name Marco Polo before, but I hope that some of you will walk away learning more than it's just a fun game to play as a kid. But he also was a world traveler that recorded his journey that has pretty big impacts on influencing future travelers in the world. So let's start with him. So Marco Polo was a Venetian. He traveled to China with his brothers and his father. And he essentially travels to China during the Yuan dynasty, where he ends up kind of visiting and staying for an extended period of time on the court of Kublai Khan. If you recall, he was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he was the head of the great Khanate of China. And so he himself would be spending a lot of time in China, recording his observations, and talks about the cities of China, how they're the greatest in the world. He has a very deep admiration for what the Chinese have accomplished and what they have in their cities when you compare it to European cities. And Venice is no slouch as far as the city goes, but they was just so well organized. They were able to, have large influx of people living in those cities, something that the Europeans at that time were much, much further behind on. So his writings, to kind of wrap up Marco Polo, his writings become a major influence on future travelers because he talks about China in a way where Europeans are like, nah, no way this is possible. And it kind of, in a sense, sparks an interest to kind of go out there and see what else is there. And you'll have other travelers who will seek ways to not only get to these places to see for themselves, but also to connect themselves to the trade of, all the things he's describing, what's available as far as goods and items and manufactured products and so forth. So, to give you an example, like Christopher Columbus, on his journey carried the journal of Marco Polo with him as like source material in case he landed somewhere where he would need to know a little bit of background information about those places. And that's, the importance of Marco Polo. He's not only important in the sense that he, did something very unique at that era, but also the influence he will have because of his writings, which were, of course, on paper. Margery Kempe is somebody that, I didn't know about. I learned about Margery Kempe when I was in school. And she was just added to the AP curriculum last year as another example of a world traveler. And Margery Kempe, when you read more into her, is just an amazing individual. She had 14 kids, and she still would be, doing these travels across the Mediterranean basin. And she was a Christian mystic. And so as a Christian, she had this very spiritual connection with her faith. And then to travel to these places, the motivating factor is to try to get a spiritual connection with these places that hold a lot of importance in her faith of Catholicism. And so she recorded her journey, as she goes into places like Jerusalem, Rome, Germany, Spain, visiting some holy sites and places, sacred sites that are important to Christianity. She talks about the kind of spiritual connections she feels with them. Now, she's also might be the very first autobiography written in English. Because, that was a bit of a rarity of that time. People didn't write about their own lives. And certainly in English language itself, where, the introduction of paper and things like that was not as, it's behind compared to China and Darul Islam, right? So then we move into Ibn Battuta. And Ibn Battuta was a Muslim scholar from Morocco. And Morocco is right over here. He lived, I think it's Tangier, or I'm not 100% certain, to be honest with you. But Morocco's right here. I know exactly which city he lived in. So Ibn Battuta is going to, go on the Hajj. And he's a Muslim. The Hajj is a very important and expected thing to do as a Muslim for those who are willing and capable to go physically and financially. And so he's going to journey to Mecca, and he'll do it multiple times. But once he leaves, he doesn't return home till for like 30 years. And during his travels, he travels through Central Asia. He travels to the Indian Ocean basin. You can see some of the routes of the travels of him during these different eras in history. And he's not always traveling. He'll settle in some places for some years, marry some wives, and kind of have kids, and and then continue to go and travel. But he, of course, records his journey as well, just like Marco Polo does, and gives us very big insight of what the world of Dar al Islam and the Muslim world look like. Because most of the areas that he is traveling through are Muslim territories, or at least the people who live there are largely Muslim. So he might be the most well-traveled man in history, and he certainly make the argument that he is the most well-traveled man in this era. Maybe not in history because the technology allows us to be able to do more so, but certainly somebody who went further than anybody else normally typically would during this era. So that's kind of 2.5 in a nutshell, like the spread of major religions, the spread of, and I forgot to mention Islam. Like Islam, we've talked about it a lot. It's there, so don't forget it. And we've talked about it ad nauseum with our previous lectures, so we just simply didn't add it into this one here. Spread of paper and gunpowder across this area. The Battle of Talas, being a huge moment of, where paper making technology then is exchanged to different peoples. So these are all kind of, here's our nice little Freemanpedia graphic, okay? So the environment, so we're moving on to 2.6, the environmental consequences. So the environment shapes human societies, and as populations grow and change, these populations then turn and shape their environment. So that's something that happens throughout history. It's not necessarily just to this period. But as far as this period goes, there was a continued diffusion of crops and pathogens with the epidemic diseases, including the bubonic plague, along trade routes. Okay, so the bubonic plague we've talked about back in 1.6, we were talking about Europe and the massive impact of, especially demographically to that. A lot of it was because of the trade that connected East and West through the Silk Roads primarily. And it must have been transferred by infected fleas. And as people travel along the Silk Road, and once the Mongols had, created this protection of trade and increased more so, more and more people are gathering in the caravanserai, those inns along the Silk Road, and you have their animals that are in stables. Getting water and so forth, and the fleas will jump off and share and so forth. So eventually, this is probably what eventually leads to them being infected on ships with rats, or the recent one was like gerbils that might have been the carrier of the plagues. But regardless, it does end up in Europe. About a third of Europe's population is killed as a result of the bubonic plague. 25 million more people are going to die, roughly. There's no way of knowing how many millions, but 25 million is the best guess estimation. East and Southeast Asia and so forth. It's not just something that's affecting Europe. It's affecting everyone that's connected to this trade. But Europe, because they had not been exposed to this particular strand as heavily or and lightly beforehand, they've suffered greatly, and their medical knowledge is well far off compared to Dar al Islam in China. So bananas in Africa is another example. This is a diffusion of a crop. We're talking about crops a little bit, okay? So bananas originally come from islands that are part of Indonesia today, and it's going to spread by travelers, by merchants who are trading, and so bananas themselves become very, very important as far as the within Africa. And so along the coast of the Swahili city-states, do you see the diffusion of bananas? Like Indonesian seafaring traders brought them to originally like Madagascar, which then make their way to the mainland of Africa and then all the way into the interior through these trade networks. And bananas were really kind of a big, important crop because they're very nutrient dense. They grow like crazy. And so this has demographic and environmental consequences because, the bananas become a crop that they're going to clear out more land and cultivate it and change the environment so they can grow more of this crop of bananas. And it has, it spreads wide because of the traveling people, the Bantu people. So bananas have a big impact overall in the civilization. of Africa. And then, of course, bananas will come introduced into South America, where a lot of them are grown today, especially ones that we get in our supermarket stores usually come from South America. Champa rice we talked about with 1.1 as an important crop that diffuses into China, coming from the Champa Kingdom, where modern-day Vietnam is. This came through the tributary state, and it was drought-resistant, it was flood-resistant, it was capable of harvesting twice a year. It's an incredible crop, and it's something that when it spreads to China, they're going to change their environment. In the northern parts of China, where they have a little more mountains, they begin to practice more terrace farming, so they're changing the environment to be able to grow more of this crop. In the south, they had a little wetter and such, but they would create rice paddies in which they can grow more of this crop. All this led to an increase of Chinese population, and even today, rice becomes a staple food of East Asian cuisine. Not just for China, but for Korea, for Japan, those nations or civilizations that were heavily influenced by the Chinese civilization. The rice basically makes it possible. So we move on to this spread of citrus in the Mediterranean, another example here, and then other things that I think are important to note, even though it's not directly mentioned as an illustrative example by College Board. But Arab traders brought along the Silk Roads from kind of Southeast Asia and India these citrus fruits, and citrus plays an important role in history. The Europeans do not travel across seas to explore and colonize if it wasn't for citrus, because it helps sailors fight off scurvy. Other products that come about through this introduction to Europeans by Arab traders would be sugar and cotton. Sugar especially is something that the Europeans are going to very much highly desire, and they just can't get enough. I mean, sugar is honestly more addictive than cocaine. It's in our food all the time. But the sugar itself, like when it's introduced, the Europeans look for more and more. Where can they get it? So when they do end up colonizing the Americas, a lot of the colonization was to set up sugar plantations. And because sugar is such a labor-intense crop, they needed as many workers on hand to do it as cheaply as it could. So this kind of led to an increase of the slave trade from Africa, and something we'll talk more about is like consequences of that trade down the road. But this is where sugar gets introduced into the Europeans. So that's it in a nutshell, and you can see on the graphic, and you guys are welcome to look at this a little bit more so. But where do things come from? Where do they go? And so on and so forth. Okay. And that wraps up Networks of Exchange 2.1. Unit 2, I should say. All the things that we've talked about. We are going to be moving into getting this tested, but also we'll be doing our first document-based question essay with relation to the material of this unit as well. So that's it from Mr. Henry's classroom. I will see you all later. If you ever need to get in contact with me, make sure you reach out via Canvas, and hope to see you all soon.